Hi everyone, today we're going to be doing a master study and we're going to be studying one of Edgar Payne's landscape paintings. I recently bought two of his books. One of them is called The Scenic Journey and this one is filled with his artworks as well as a story about his life and his journey as an artist. And I highly recommend both of these books. This one that I'm flipping through now is full of his beautiful paintings and really high quality color reproductions, and it also includes some of his sketches, so it's really interesting to see some of the behind the scenes of his painting process. The painting we're going to be studying is one of his Grand Canyon paintings, and I thought this one would be good to study because there's a lot of atmospheric perspective. The second book that I got is his book on composition called Composition of Outdoor Painting. This book is also highly regarded by artists, as Edgar Payne is known as the master of composition. So in the book he talks about some common composition designs like O-shape, S-shape, L-shape, cross, radiating lines, diagonal lines, etc. And it's just a really interesting read, as well as full of good examples of things to do and certain compositions to avoid. So for our master study today, we're going to start first by doing a black and white study, which I think is really important to set the foundation for the color piece. You'd be surprised at how much you learn from doing a black and white value study before doing color. And we're going to keep the colors really simple. For the value study, just black and white, and for the color study, I'm just going to use 3 primaries plus white. So that's lemon yellow, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue. And I'll be using toned tan paper from Strathmore for both of the studies, because when I look at his painting, I note that there's a warm undertone peeking through. He likely would have toned his canvas. So starting with toned tan paper just gives us a bit of a head start, and it's also easier for some people to measure value against instead of measuring against white paper. So starting with the drawing, it's not too complicated. I basically just divide off the sky, which is less than 1/4 of the space. And I should also mention that I cut my paper to the same dimensions as the original painting, and therefore it should be easier for me to fit my drawing to the same dimensions as the original painting, although you'll see later that I did have some struggles with placing in the canyons and in the right places to give me enough space. But overall, if you keep the dimensions the same as the original painting, it should make the study a little bit easier for you. And so with the drawing, the next thing I did was I noted there's kind of a diagonal line from where the top of the main canyon hits to the bottom left side of it. It's in a backwards L shape, and so I put in a diagonal line for that, and then now I'm just mapping out the individual shapes, and I really try to observe the shapes that he's used. So one thing I've learned about composition recently is that shape design is absolute key to a good painting. And if you look at good paintings, you'll notice that no 2 shapes are ever repeated. So take another look at this painting and just you can even use a marker. Let's say you've printed out this painting, or you can do it digitally on Photoshop or something. Take a marker and just outline the different shapes in this painting, and you'll notice that no 2 ones repeat. They're all like jigsaw puzzle pieces that are different, and so that's really interesting. And I also take note of the big, medium, and small shapes, because there's a variety of those as well, and then a variety in the different kinds of shapes. So not just variety in size of shape, but also the kind of shapes. And So I'm calling this a master study, not so much a master copy, because we're not trying to copy the painting exactly as it is. We're trying to really study it and try to absorb some of the knowledge from the artist who did this, or try to get into their brain and think what might they have been thinking when they were designing this painting. I should also note that I'm keeping the reference photo in color on screen. When I do value studies, I look at the color version because I'm trying to train my eye to be able to convert color into value. If you want to make this a little bit easier, you can put up a black and white version of the painting. It just makes your life easier, but I think it's really critical that you also practice doing studies, value studies from color photos, because let's say when you go out to plein air in real life, you can't really turn your whole world black and white. You have to look at color and be able to judge its relative value. So to start with, I'm going to block in some of the lightest values. So I'm just grabbing some black with mostly white and blocking out the sky. That's the easiest thing. I can see that the sky is the lightest value, and then second is the I think it's bright yellow rocks on the left side, and there's some foliage there. And I'm observing the shapes of them while blocking in the value. Now I'm just cleaning off my brush because I want to mix up a dark value and block in the big dark shapes of the obvious canyon rock ledge on the right hand side, the backwards L shape. So I'm using mostly black with a bit of white. And when you're doing any painting, not just a study, you should always start with the biggest shapes first, so try and squint down at the reference photo or the painting and ignore all the little details. So I'm not looking at the subtle variations in value in that rock face. I'm just generalizing it. I am assigning it one average value, and I'm going to block that in, because if you start going into all the little subtle variations now, you might find that actually your values were off to begin with. You weren't able to judge them against the full range of values used in the rest of your painting. So there's no point getting into details from the start. You want to be really efficient with your strokes, going big, bold at the start, and then as you progress through the painting, then you start to move into smaller and smaller shapes. I heard an artist say that details is nothing more than just breaking big shapes down into little shapes, and I really like the thought of that, rather than thinking of detail as trying to render your way to a finished painting. Just think about how the small shapes are just broken down bits of a large shape, and the large shape must be correct in order for the little shapes to work. So I'm just carving my way around, and I really try to make a goal to make my shapes a bit more graphic, a bit more kind of hard edge, not softening anything, no blending, just graphic shapes that I'm laying down and really trying to carve away at things. At this point, I thought I wanted to maybe wash a bit of value over the background, but I quickly realized that was a mistake. That value was too dark, and actually I liked the value of the paper, so I'm just sweeping it up now to remove that. And one way you can remove gouache if you've laid it down and it's not what you want is you can wet the paint on the paper, kind of dilute it down, and then use a tissue to just absorb it. So that's what I'm doing, and then I'm going to just kind of keep working away at carving away the shapes, and gradually as I move back, I'm going to lighten the value by adding more white, as there's more atmosphere between us and things in the background, the value grows lighter and lighter. And when you move on to doing the color study, you'll realize just how important it was you did this value study. Now you know that when you are mixing the colors for things in the distance, you'll know that you have to not only control the color temperature, saturation, but also the value. And I think that value always comes first when you paint. So often when we talk about color, we think of the hue, so blue, red, yellow. That's what we generally think of when we talk about color, but actually color is made up of 3 properties. It's made up of hue, saturation, and value. And of the 3, I'd say value comes first, and then second would be saturation and color temperature, and then lastly would be the hue. If you can get the value right and the saturation right, as well as the color temperature right, you can almost choose to any color and your painting will still make sense. Now looking at the reference photo, I'm noting that those bits of foliage in the rocks on the left, they're quite dark. So even though the foliage is, or some of it is in the sun, usually green has a pretty dark local color. So even though it's sunlit, it looks bright because there's a lot of warm yellow sun hitting it, and you would think yellow is a light value, a light color, but a green color in the sun, or depending on what kind of green and how it's being lit, if it's backlit green, it can be a really light value because it's much more similar to yellow. But if it's like a dark green bush and it's getting hit by warm sunlight, surprisingly the local value of the bush, even the part that's in the sun, is still pretty dark. So just squinting your eyes down at the reference, you'll see that I'd say it's as dark as, the rock face on the right. So I'm just placing that in, and again trying my best not to get lost in the details and just trying to paint in shapes. It is challenging, and I will say that that part on the left challenged me the most. So don't be disheartened if you feel like even doing a value study is difficult, because it was challenging. And I hope you'll enjoy this kind of tutorial, or I'm gonna put it under the section of study with me / sketchbook studies, which is a series that I'm trying to do. So for me, it's kind of like 2 birds, 1 stone. I get to study and learn and grow and show you my process for doing that, and then at the same time you get content. It's not necessarily a tutorial. I think it would be useful if you maybe paint along with me, and then where you're having pain points, you can refer to what I'm doing and see if that can help you resolve it, because the hard work and the learning and growth of this comes from doing the studying bit. So there's a lot going on in my brain as I'm painting these things. So it'd be good to challenge yourself to exercise your brain, to do these studies alongside me. But whatever works best for you, it would be good to hear your feedback if you enjoy this kind of content, because I think this will be really good for me. It'll mean I can keep growing and learning new things, and then be able to share it directly with you by showing you my process and how I study. So now I've almost filled in all of the value of the paper, which is one of our first goals. You want to cover the paper completely so you have all your values in, and you can judge everything against another. And I just decided to block in the whole background section into an average value, and then I'll paint in the canyons one by one, getting lighter as they recede back. And I'm also just poking in a few light areas now. Looking at myself doing this study, I feel like I could be a lot more efficient. I could make bigger, bolder strokes. I do feel like I'm going too slow in a sense, but I guess that's also because I have the hindsight of knowing the structure of this painting now. There's a huge difference between just looking at a painting and then taking the time to study it. You'll notice so many more things that you just didn't before just from looking at the painting. So doing master studies is really, really helpful, and I hear other people say it all the time, how doing master studies really elevated their paintings and they learned so much. And I think in the past I misunderstood what it meant to do a master study. I always thought of it as a master copy, and I would just try and copy the colors, copy their brushstroke, and I wasn't really thinking about the process of it, how to approach it, thinking about how to get into the mindset of the artist, which those are the most important things. It's not about making a painting look exactly like the artist you're trying to copy. It's trying to learn from them. So I'm definitely taking a different mindset in the master studies that I do now, and I hope I can convey to you the thought process of that and the thought that I'm putting into when I'm doing these studies. So now I'm almost done with the front half section of the paintings, or a lot of the foreground elements, and I'm going to start pushing into the midground and the background, and you'll just see that I'm just going to add more white into my paint as I'm moving back, and again just trying to observe the shape of the canyons and just trying to block them in graphically. I'm using a 1/2 inch angle brush to start with. It's good to use like a flat or angle brush at the start because it forces you to be more graphic, and it's good to use a brush that's bigger than what you're comfortable with. Ideally, it would be good if maybe I started with a 3/4 or 1 inch brush. That'll probably force me to be faster and more efficient. And then later I'll move into using a round brush because I must admit I was struggling a little bit with the shapes, and sometimes with the 1/2 inch angle brush I do give up on trying to make nice shapes with it, and I just resort to using a round brush. But it's a bit of a push and pull. It's getting used to it and putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, so you kind of train yourself to be able to understand a brush really well and get the most out of it, rather than using smaller brushes and getting lost in detail. As I'm moving back in space, I'm being very conscious to lighten my values just slightly, and I'm squinting a lot at the reference photo, and that just really helps me to eliminate details and just to see the average values and the bigger blocks of shapes. If you keep your eyes wide open and look into an area, you'll see a lot of details and just tiny little differences. But if you squint down, you'll notice how a lot of it just fades away, and what's left is what's important and what should be emphasized. And we should really be conscious of not overemphasizing contrast in one area. We always need to look at the painting as a whole and judge the relationship of one thing to everything else in the painting. So if you get too bogged down in one area, your contrast may be too strong, or you've used a value that's too dark or too light, and you haven't compressed your values enough. So for example, if I'm painting those background distant canyons, and then I forget to judge them against the main big rock in the front, then I might start to paint them too dark. But in reality, they are quite a bit of a step down in value from our darkest dark. So we have to really keep that in mind. as we're working through the value study, and take the time now to just really study value before we jump into the color study. I always find it's more therapeutic to be working in black and white, which is why I especially love to do drawing and sketching. I'm never in a rush to move on to painting before I get the fundamentals down with drawing, because I think I'm just given so much more freedom to just focus on the fundamentals, the values, which is the most important thing. And to me, I feel that if you can't get the values right, say in a drawing or in a black and white value painting, you're going to have a much harder time getting the color painting correct. So enjoy the black and white study, as your brain space is a lot more freed up. You don't have to think about color, just think light or dark, and constantly compare values with each other. And you can practice softening your gaze at the reference photo and using your peripheral vision to see which areas of contrast jump out at you, which areas have sharper edges and softer edges. Now that I've covered all of the white of the paper, I am starting to kind of pull out a little bit of the contrast in there by pulling out some of the lights, and I'm thinking about planes as well. So planes referring to the angle of the surface. For example, if the sun is coming from above, then all the planes that are facing upwards at the sun will be lighter than the planes that are, say, vertical and at more of an angle to the sun. So by thinking about planes, it can also help you to bring more dimensionality to your painting. The study took me around 30 minutes to do, which I think is an okay amount of time for a value study. Ideally, the shorter, the better in a sense. If I could have done it in, say, half the time, perhaps I would have made more bolder decisions and been clearer about my choices. But it takes time and practice to get faster at making decisions. It's a learning process. And then the color study took me about an hour. So in total, this study took me an hour and a half, and I think it was really well worth the time. I learned a lot through this process. It was really insightful, and I'm excited to jump into the color study next to talk about my thoughts there. So at this stage, you can see I've already got the big picture down. What I'm just missing are some of the smaller shapes and just refining my shapes a little bit better. They're not super accurate to the reference. So that's what I'm working on for the last 10 minutes of the study. It's interesting how at this point, if you fast forward to the finished black and white study and you compare that to where I'm at now, the difference is quite small because the big picture is already here. So it's really interesting how the first part of any painting or drawing, you see the most amount of change and progress being made. And then the last part, or especially the middle section, you can spend many, many hours and it almost looks like there's been such minimal changes being made. And I think it just goes to show that how you start a block in of a painting or a drawing is really important. It really sets the foundation and the structure, the big picture for your final piece. And that overarching big picture is not lost. It actually doesn't change that much. As I said before, detail is just breaking down big shapes into small shapes. So once your big shapes are there, when you step back and look at your painting or drawing from afar, it should read as a complete painting, even if the details are not there, because details are only for when you come in close and you look at it close up, but from afar it should always read very clearly. Or another way to think of it is if you shrink your painting down into a tiny thumbnail, it should read clearly, and at that size it's just not possible to see any details. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about how if you set up your painting well, then the last section, which you may actually spend a lot of time on getting into little shapes, details and things like that, they actually don't make as big of a difference as they do in the first part, where if you just lay down a solid foundation, you've really set yourself up for the rest of the painting. We've got about 8 minutes left in the valley study, so I'm just going to leave you here and then I'll meet you at the color study. For the color study, I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on the drawing to get it a bit more accurate, because in the value study I noticed that my spacing felt a little bit cramped. I didn't have enough space to get the background shapes in as accurately as I would have liked. So I'm going to take a little bit more time in this drawing just to map out the shadows, and I even do a little bit of cross hatching just to block out the shadows, just to make sure my shapes are set up in the right space and they have enough space. It doesn't mean that I'm being really detailed in the drawing phase, because there's no point. I'm going to start painting and cover it up. It's just to have that confidence and assurance that I've mapped out the big shapes in the right places. When you're drawing, try to use straight lines when you're starting the block in, because it makes it much easier for you to compare lengths, distances, and angles, rather than using rounded, curved lines. It's a lot harder to judge those things. So even if what you're drawing is round, try and find the longest, straightest lines that you can. Even when you're drawing a sphere, you can start the drawing of the sphere with a square, and from there you cut off the corners and then you find the roundness of the circle. It can be a hard habit to break. I know for myself, I naturally, as I assume with most people, we naturally want to draw rounded, softer things, especially if what we're looking at is soft and round. We just want to copy it. But you really have to force yourself to find straight lines and angles. And along with that, you need to ignore all the little lumps and bumps that you see along a line and just average it out to one straight line at a certain angle. So just taking that rock face at the very front, you can see if I trace the outline of it, you can see there's bumps here and there, but I want to ignore that when I'm doing the initial block in, because what I want to put in is the correct angle and length of the line, ignoring all those other things. Because if you have the big shape wrong, then it doesn't matter how beautiful the little curves are. If they're in the wrong place or the proportion is wrong at one point or another, you'll have to erase it and do it again. So learning to start with straight lines just means you'll save yourself a lot of time. It's a good habit to cultivate. It's a good way to start your drawing. We're just about done with the drawing now, and I'm just going to talk about color just before we jump into it. So I'm going to be using a limited palette. I'll be using ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, lemon yellow, and white. And the reason I chose only those 3 colors plus white is because it simplifies the process. You may think that having more colors makes it easier, but for beginners especially, it's actually a lot more challenging. If you don't have a solid understanding of how to mix all the colors you need from just the primaries, you can easily get overwhelmed and confused by the additional colors that you add. So I wanted to break down my thinking with just the 3 primary colors and show you how that's all you really need to do most paintings. So how I like to think about the 3 colors we'll be using today plus white is you've got 2 cools and 2 warms relatively. So the yellow and the red are your warmer colors, and the blue and white are your cooler colors, which means if I'm adding red or yellow to a color, it's going to warm it up relatively. And then if I'm adding blue or white to a color, it's going to cool it down relatively. So instead of thinking about absolute color or thinking what kind of blue is that, what kind of red is that, I want to just focus on temperature, color temperature when I'm doing the master study. So I want to look at Edgar Payne's painting and I want to think, okay, what's happening to the colors as they move back in space? They're becoming cooler. I'm not just trying to match the shade of blue or match the shade of purple or red or yellow. I'm just thinking, okay, he's going towards blue and lighter, so things are getting cooler. And if you just go for that effect, it doesn't matter if your color is exactly like his or not. Your whole painting will work as a whole because relatively it makes sense. And that's the kind of thinking we need for our own paintings. If we practice copying paintings without thinking critically about what's happening to color temperature and saturation and value, then when we go to do our own paintings, we're still going to be stuck because we haven't worked our brains in that way. And you'll notice that, or you'll learn that painting is 90% problem solving. The whole process of doing a painting really is just solving a problem. How do we turn this 3D landscape or object we're looking at and put it onto a 2-dimensional piece of paper or a surface, but create the illusion of it looking 3-dimensional? And so we have all these tools at our disposal and we have to learn how to use them to create that realistic effect. So my mindset with doing a master study is to put myself in the shoes of that artist and think, okay, what was he doing? What was he thinking? Or I'm just analyzing what I think he did. And the more you do of these, the more you'll be building up your own library of knowledge. And when you go to do your own painting, you can pull that piece of knowledge out and you can recall, okay, things in this kind of lighting situation, things generally go cooler, which usually means they go bluer into the distance. Now we're ready to get started with our painting, and I'm going to be starting with the 1/2-inch angle brush. So starting with the sky, I'm going to pick up a lot of white and then mix in a touch of blue, a touch of red, and also a touch of yellow. And you'll find that most colors are made up of a mixture of all 3 of the primaries, blue, yellow, red, but just in varying amounts, of course. So if something is bluer or cooler, it'll have more blue. If it's warmer and redder, it'll have more red. If it's warmer and more yellow, then it'll have more yellow. So if you're ever feeling stuck, just think to yourself, does it lean more towards yellow, more towards red, or more towards blue? Because it's probably a combination of all 3 of them plus white, but it just has a bias towards one. So I'm putting in a really light sky that is a mixture of all three primaries. And the nice thing about using toned paper is when you lay down that light value, you can really see it against the value of the paper. My goal now is just to block in all of the paper before I start changing things and judging value against one another. So next, after I've blocked in the sky, I'm going to just wash in a bit of color for the distance. The paper value is actually pretty accurate to the value I want, but I'm just going to put down a little wash of color. So I'm going to add a little bit of blue, a little bit more red and yellow into my mixture, and just give a bit of a background wash to the very distant canyons. One thing you always have to keep in mind with gouache is that the values will almost for certain dry differently. Dark values dry dramatically lighter and light values will dry darker. So always keep that in the back of your mind. Even as someone who's painted with gouache a lot, it doesn't mean that you know exactly how light or dark the value will dry to. You just know that it will be different, and you keep that in the back of your mind always, and you just know that there is a chance you'll have to come back and rework things, and you almost force yourself to overshoot just a little bit. So for example, with my dark values, I'll overshoot and I'll go a little bit darker than I need because I know it's going to dry lighter. So after roughly blocking in some of the background, I'm going to clean off my brush and then I'm going to move on to blocking in the dark values in the foreground. You don't want to get stuck painting one area of the painting for too long because, like I said, the goal is to cover all of the white, or in this case the toned tan of the paper, so you can judge your values accurately, and from there you can make big adjustments or small adjustments as needed. So I've cleaned off my brush and now I'm going to mix up some yellow and red, mostly red, bit of yellow, and then a little bit of ultramarine blue to tone it down. And I'm going to just start to block in that right side shape, and I'll ignore all the little variations that I see in there. I want to squint down and check the value first and foremost, and I can see that I can definitely average it out to one value. Then there's some little variations in there, which I would prefer to come back later to put in those subtle variations. So I'm mostly going to block it in with a dark red color that's a little bit toned down. Even though when we look at a color in a painting, we might think that's red, but if you pick a pure red and you put that on your canvas, I can guarantee it's going to be too saturated. So there's very few situations in which a pure color straight out of the tube is used, and if it is, it would be in a really specific and small area. So most of the time you would mix in other colors with your pure colors from the tube. So it's not just a bright alizarin crimson. I've got red, yellow and blue all mixed together, but red and yellow dominate the mixture in this case. And I can see that there are actually two separate rock faces in the foreground, but if you squint down at it, you can just compress it into one to start with. If you look at a big photo of the painting, it's very obvious, but if you put it down to a thumbnail size, it's actually not so obvious, and that's the way that we want to paint it. Now, as I'm moving down towards the left-hand side, I can see it's a little bit darker. I see a little bit more bluish, purplish hue, so I'm just going to add in a little bit more ultramarine blue. Another thing to keep in mind with your colors and why it's good to practice painting with just the primaries is we can think of each color as doing two things whenever we mix with it. One, it's either going to warm up or cool down the color, and two, it's either going to make the value darker or lighter. So each color has an inherent value. Colors like yellow have a really light value, whereas colors like blue, purples, reds, greens typically have a darker value. And obviously white is going to lighten the value of your mixture. So at the same time, while I'm shifting my colors, I'm also thinking about how to shift value. So if I want a darker value, I'm not going to add yellow. I need to add blue and red to the mixture to make it darker. If you practice thinking value first and color second, you'll find that you get an accurate color a lot faster, and it'll be more accurate more of the time. So I know for a lot of the tutorials that I've made on Patreon, I paint from background to foreground, starting from the top of the paper and working forwards. But I've actually found that when I'm trying to paint depth and atmospheric perspective, it makes more sense for me to start from the foreground and move backwards, meaning I start with saturated, warmer colors, and then I cool them down and I lighten them and desaturate them as I move back. It's easier to go that way with paint than it is to take a desaturated light color and try and warm it up and raise the value. So you can see here, I'm starting to shift my colors backwards in space as I'm painting in the shapes of the canyons. So the rock face at the front is very red, very warm, much more saturated. And then now I'm going to start adding in a little bit more white, a little bit more blue, and I'm going to add less and less yellow until eventually I don't add any more yellow. So in space, the color that drops out first is your yellows, and then afterwards your reds drop out, and then you're just left with blues. And I believe that's just to do with the wavelengths of colors and their ability to reach our eyes when they're far away in space. So you'll never see anything be bright yellow far in the distance. It'll most likely be blue. And you can think of yellow things as moving towards orange, red in the distance. So when you're painting things far in the distance, it's safer to go a little bit more orange than it is to go yellow with them, if that makes sense. So as I'm moving back, I'm adding more blue. And then the tricky thing here is knowing that my dark colors will dry lighter, I do have to just go a little bit darker. I'm looking at it now and it looks too dark to me. That's not the final value I want, but I just have to trust that it's going to lighten to the right value. And what is so interesting about editing my own videos is when I'm skimming through my footage, I can see my paint drying really quickly, and the change in value can be quite dramatic. So it always just reconfirms to me that gouache indeed does dry to a different value. Now I washed off my brush and I've just put down a bit more ultramarine blue on my palette, and I'm really punching in those cooler blues into those canyons in the distance. I've done a more accurate drawing this time, so it should make this step a little bit easier for me, but at the same time, I have lost parts of the drawing as I started to paint. You shouldn't worry about losing your drawing too much as you paint, because if you've drawn it once, you can probably find the lines again. You'd be surprised at how much you remember or learnt while you were drawing. Now I'm cleaning off my brush again, and I'm going to switch to a round brush and fill in the rest of the shapes that way. So I'm still going to go cooler and bluer as I move back. That's a given. I'm just mixing in more white and blue, both cool off colors. So mixing them together definitely is going to push that atmospheric perspective. And atmospheric perspective just refers to particles in the air between us and objects that change the appearance of the colors in distant objects. And it is one of two ways, or there's many ways to build perspective into a painting or drawing, but atmospheric perspective and linear perspective is used. So it's a really powerful piece of knowledge to have, and once you understand it, you'll be able to build a lot more depth and dimensionality into your paintings. Another thing that happens to colors as they move back is the shadows and the lights will merge into one value. You don't see the shadows on the mountains anymore because they've become so light that they merge with the light values, and the light colors will go just a slight bit darker, and then they don't meet in the middle because the shadows go a lot lighter, but they meet somewhere where they become one flat value and color. Now I want to move on to blocking in the bright yellow rock face in the front left corner. And I apologize that some of my footage got cut out. I didn't realize that my camera stopped recording. But basically I just mixed yellow with white and a little bit of red, and I just blocked in that front area. You do have to be careful with mixing in white with yellow because the white will cool off the yellow, and if you're going for a really warm, saturated yellow, you're best off avoiding white until you really need it. So one way around it is perhaps you can make the surrounding colors darker, and that will make the yellow look brighter relatively. And then now I'm mixing a bit of red with the yellow and painting in some of the orange glow that I can see in there. So overall the colors in that left corner are all really, really warm and really quite bright, and some of the lightest values in the whole painting. And then I'm going to mix a little bit of ultramarine blue with a little bit of yellow just to put in some of those dark green foliage on the rocks on the left. And one reason why that left hand corner really stands out is because there's the most amount of contrast there. Contrast in colors and contrast in value. You've got the bright light yellows against the dark bluish greens, so value contrast and color contrast, oranges against blues, reds against greens. I also try to find other areas in the painting which have similar value and color. That's one way to speed up your painting, is instead of painting section by section, you always paint the painting as a whole, at least for a large majority of the process. And you look for areas of similarity in value or color. And so you place them in at the same time while you have the paint on your brush. And then you kind of judge the painting as a whole. And only towards the end do you maybe start to work on each individual section detail by detail. When I'm mixing my lighter greens, I try to mix yellow in to lighten the green rather than adding white. White is going to cool off the green and make it appear a little bit pastel-y, a bit pasty and not warm. And because these greens are being hit by sunlight, so they're really warm, so to keep it warm, I'm going to add yellow to it. At this point, I've covered all of the paper and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. You can see that the big picture is there, it's just lacking refinement in shapes and it's lacking details. So now I'm going to start diving into specific areas a little bit more and really refining and defining the shapes. And I'm starting with some of the light shapes, so the planes that are facing upwards and receiving the sunlight. And I'm mixing yellow and red with that, and I'm just going to place those in. I've left gaps in between for those areas. I left some of the light areas out so I could come back later and fill them in, and that's what I'm doing now. And then you'll see that the painting slowly comes together. At this point, as I'm judging the painting, I can start to feel more comfortable moving into a little bit more of detail work or just finding those subtle variations. I don't feel comfortable doing that at the start because I have no idea if my big picture is right and I could just be wasting time. But at this point, the gouache has dried, so I can judge everything and then make adjustments as needed before diving into some detail work. One thing I'm noticing is that this area of the front rock, it's too dark in value. So I'm lightening it with a little bit of a lighter value. You'll see that when you apply water to dried gouache on the paper or the canvas that you're working on, the value is going to go darker. So water is what makes the paint look dark. And once the water evaporates, that's why the gouache looks lighter as a result. So what I did was I just ran over that area with a wet brush as I was trying to change the value, but what it does in the moment is it makes it a lot darker, but I know that when it dries it's going to be lighter. It's very tricky and it's just something that comes with experience and practice and just learning to trust your instinct with these things. Now I'm still going through the painting and I'm adding in or punching in a little bit of those lights, so yellow and red, but as we move back in space there's going to be less yellow and a little bit more red and more white, so the light effect is not as strong, it's not as warm of a light, but comparatively compared to the cool blues and purples it is warmer. Another great thing about studying these kind of subject matters, these are rocky cliff faces, canyons, is that they're a great way to study planes. So you might be wondering, why are some areas of the face more red? Why are some areas more blue? Or why are some areas warmer? Why are some areas cooler? And that's to do with the way the plane of the face is facing. So I'm talking about the areas that are in shadow. So if an area of a face is in shadow but it's exposed to the sky, it's upward facing, it's going to be cooler. And generally that is the cast shadows from the canyons, say, casting onto the ground. If you observe the cast shadow portion, you'll notice that it's bluer, whereas the rock face itself is a little bit redder, a little bit warmer, a bit more purpley, and that's because it's at a vertical angle, and so it receives less blue skylight than the ground plane, which is fully facing towards the sky in the shadow. And that's another interesting thing to just make a note of and to study and to understand when I do master studies, I like to ask myself questions and try to answer them. If there's something you're wondering, like why did the artist use this color, or why does this look like this, it's a good idea to find an answer, because there probably is one. It's unlikely that it was just by chance. There must be some reasoning, logic, or knowledge behind why a particular choice was made. And I think that's where a lot of the learning comes from when you're doing master studies. It's asking those questions and seeking out those answers. I'm now finding a couple more subtle variations in those colors of the canyons in the distance. And as I mentioned before, I'm observing the car shadows and form shadows and seeing why some of them are warmer and cooler, and just adding a bit of variation in there. But it is really tricky because I have to control the values very carefully. If they get just a little bit too dark, they're going to come forward in space instead of receding back. And I go over some areas a few times. After it dries, I reevaluate the value, and then I cover it again with a more appropriate value. Now I'm going to start splitting out the big shapes into more smaller shapes. So starting with the canyon in the front, as I mentioned earlier, there's actually a separate face there, and I'm going to split it out. I can see a darker, redder, warmer section, and there's a little bit of light on top of that plane as it's facing towards the sunlight. So I'm splitting out that shape now, knowing that my value structure is in place. So to make it darker in value, I need to add a little bit of ultramarine blue to the red, but then I also add a little bit of yellow as well. And then as I move down, it's a little bit more of an orange, has a bit more of a warm glow. So I'm adding more yellow into the mixture. I'm finding more variety, subtle variations in colors and value again over here. So just shifting my colors very slightly, a little bit more yellow here, a little bit more white here, and still constantly squinting at the painting, both at my painting and at Edgar Payne's painting, to judge value, always keeping that in check. Nothing should fall out of the value structure as you're making these subtle variations, meaning that it should still read as one big shape, or you should still see the average value that you see when you squint down at the painting. now I'm assessing my painting. As we inch towards the end of the study, I constantly pause to take stock of my painting and see what's missing, what is different about my study versus the original painting. And remember, we're not trying to copy the original painting exactly. We're trying to get the feel of it through our own painting by understanding what's going on in the original and then studying it and translating it into our study of it or our copy of it, but not copying it color for color, detail for detail. So what I'm assessing at every stage is perhaps the contrast. Do I have enough contrast in areas where the original painting is pushing that contrast, whether that be value contrast or color contrast, saturation contrast? One thing that I typically do towards the end of the painting is I really punch in those darkest darks or lightest lights, and that really can bring the painting to life and make it look real. And so I'm noticing that I need some more darks in the rock face that's close to us, that darker bit just next to the yellow. That's where the strongest contrast in between that deep dark red and that bright sunlit yellow color. So I'm putting that in now, and I go darker than I think I need. You have to be bold because it's going to dry lighter in value. Then I make an assessment of everything else in the painting. Is anything too cool or too warm? Do I need to push anything else? It really is just a push and pull the whole time. Do I need to turn the planes of things? Are there any subtle turns that I need to convey? Meaning when a light face meets a dark face, so something light facing meets something in the shadow, there's a half tone in between where the plane turns and rounds over, and I need to convey that in order to make the object look like it's turning. So I check for those areas, and I'm noticing that I can darken some of the values slightly of the canyons in the distance. If they're all one value, then again the whole image can go flat, or at least that part of the image can go flat. If the distant canyons are much lighter than the canyon in the foreground, then we'll have distance between the two. But if there is no gradation from warm to cool moving all the way to the background, then the background itself can fall a little bit flat. And so what I'm trying to do now is just bring out a little bit more of that subtle gradation without overdoing it. So keeping the value structure there, but just bring out a bit more distance through color, temperature, and value. I'm almost at the end of the study. What I want to work on now is the front left section. As I mentioned before about turning the plane, what I'm noticing is that section is not conveying the form very clearly. If I just lay down one flat color, then that rock face will look flat. And so I'm putting in a bit of the halftone, putting in those faces which are turning just slightly away from the light, but still in the light family, and conveying how it turns into shadow. And once I place those in, you'll start to see that section starts to come to life, has more dimension to it. So this brings us to the end of our first master study together. I chose to do a voiceover for this study rather than what I usually do, which is record myself speaking live as I'm painting, because I knew that I would need a lot of brain power to focus on the study. Not to say that my other tutorials don't require as much brain power, but doing a study like this, I just knew that I really needed to free up just that bit of extra brain space to focus and think through. And the reason I'm saying this is because these master studies are not easy in a sense. You really have to think a lot as you're working through them. So I hope that I was able to show you the thinking behind the process. For this voiceover, it's not as much about what colors specifically I'm mixing to get what, because I'm only using 3 colors plus white. There isn't that much in a sense to the color mixing. It's either adding more red, yellow, blue, or white. And what I wanted to talk about more was my thinking behind my choices. So I hope you enjoy doing this. I'm looking forward to doing more like this and turning it into a series where we can learn together and you can hear more of my thoughts. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you in another video here. Thanks so much for watching and see you soon.